Hello there, and welcome to the Mad Human Channel, your quiet corner of the mind where curiosity meets calm, and questions stretch out into long, winding paths of thought. Tonight, we're not floating down the strange river of time or wandering the landscapes of memory, but instead, we're stepping into the quiet green world that surrounds us. A world that has been here long before we spoke our first words, and will remain long after our voices fade. A world where the tallest beings do not walk, yet they live, breathe, and in their own way speak. I'd love to know, where are you listening from? And what does the world outside your window look like tonight? Share it in the comments, because it always amazes me how these gentle journeys connect people across so many places and seasons. And if tonight's exploration stirs something in you, a memory of walking through a forest, the smell of damp earth after rain, or the way sunlight filters through leaves, feel free to leave a gentle like, maybe subscribe, so you can return here when curiosity calls you back. Now, if you wish, close your eyes. Let the weight of the day slip from your shoulders. Breathe slow, steady, unhurried, like the wind winding through branches. We won't be rushing ahead, but instead, moving patiently, listening deeply, stepping into the stillness to hear something most of us have never noticed. The conversations of trees. They have no mouths, no tongues, no voices. And yet, beneath the soil and in the air above, they share food, send warnings, nurture the young, and comfort the old. They speak without words, through pulses of sugar, whispers of scent, and an underground web so vast and ancient, it makes even the greatest human cities seem like passing shadows. Then we begin. Beneath your feet, hidden from the rush of human footsteps, lies a network so intricate it could be mistaken for the wiring of the brain itself. A lattice of roots and threads of fungi stretching out in all directions, linking one tree to another in silent communion. And here in this shadowy underworld, messages flow. Not in sentences, not in sounds, but in pulses of chemistry, in droplets of carbon-rich sugar, in faint electrical signals that ripple through living wood like slow lightning. And this is where the forest speaks, not to the ears but to the senses of its own kind. A beech sends a warning of a caterpillar attack, releasing chemical cues into the air that nearby trees can catch on the wind, prompting them to flood their leaves with bitter tannins before the hungry mouths arrive. And even the tiniest saplings, hidden under thick canopies and unable to catch enough sunlight, are quietly fed by their elders through root connections, the older trees passing sugars down like a parent placing bread in a child's hand, ensuring survival through seasons too dark and cold for the young to endure alone, and scientists call this the wood wide web. But to the trees it is simply life, the way the forest has always been, a language without a single spoken word, yet more eloquent than any poem. Imagine for a moment that you could hear it, not in the quick chatter of human speech but in the drawn-out cadence of centuries, where a single message might take days to travel from one grove to another, and still, the meaning is never lost, because in the world of trees, patience is not a virtue. It is a law, and within this stillness, there is a richness of connection we rarely touch in our own lives, for while we race to answer messages that vanish in seconds, the trees hold conversations that may outlive us, their slow exchange of warnings, reassurances, and resources shaping the health of the entire forest in ways we are only beginning to understand. They remember, too, in a way. An acacia that has once been bitten by a giraffe will alter its chemistry faster the next time it senses that tall shadow nearby, a kind of living memory stored not in a brain but in the tissues of bark and leaf, and the signals they send are not selfish, not limited to kin alone, for they often stretch between species, birch to fir, oak to maple. A reminder that the boundaries we draw between individuals are softer in the plant world, where survival depends on the network as much as on the self, and even in death, a tree's roots may remain alive, sustained by its neighbors, continuing to act as bridges for nutrients, its last role one of service to the living. Above ground, too, their messages travel. A leaf crushed under an insect's jaws releases a volatile chemical that floats on the breeze, detected by another plant dozens of meters away, prompting it to mount its own defenses, and to us it might seem like instinct, like chemistry without consciousness. But perhaps that is only because we are not fluent in their language, for if life can adapt, respond, and communicate without neurons, Perhaps we must widen our definition of what it means to speak, to listen, to care. Walk through a forest with this in mind, and it no longer feels like rows of silent trunks, but like entering a cathedral of conversation. Every branch a sentence, every rustle a phrase, every scent a coded signal in a dialogue as old as the soil itself, and you begin to understand that their stillness is not emptiness but attention, their slowness not delay but depth, and that the stories they tell are not about fleeting moments but about centuries, about the rise and fall of seasons, about drought and flood, about fire and regrowth, about kinship and endurance, and somewhere deep within that understanding, you might realize that we too are part of their story, for we breathe the air they exhale, we rest in their shade, we build our homes from their bodies, and yet, rarely do we pause to listen back. Perhaps because their language cannot be rushed and we have forgotten how to wait. But if you stand still long enough, if you let your own racing thoughts slow to the rhythm of wind and leaves, you may feel it. Not as a sound in your ears but as a shift in the air, a subtle recognition that you are being noticed, that the trees are aware of your presence in the only way they can be, and they have always been, watching us grow, stumble, and pass on, while they remain, rooted but never idle, bound together in the oldest network on Earth. Then we sink deeper still, past the thin layer of leaves and soil where light still filters through, into the dense, damp darkness where roots stretch like slow-moving rivers, twisting and weaving into one another until it becomes impossible to tell where one tree ends and another begins, and here the fungi, those pale, thread-like hyphae, slip into the fine tips of roots and fuse with them in a partnership so ancient it predates the human species entirely. A bond where neither partner can be called master or servant, for they are collaborators in survival. The fungi extending the tree's reach into the soil, pulling in water and rare minerals from distances the tree alone could never touch, and in return the tree sends down carbon-rich sugars it has crafted from sunlight, feeding its fungal allies in a slow, unbroken exchange that may last centuries. It is through these fungal threads, thinner than a human hair yet capable of stretching across forests, that much of the forest's conversation takes place, chemical signals flowing from root to root, carrying messages of plenty and of scarcity, of health and of distress, and in these signals lies the forest's collective memory, the shared knowledge of which patches of earth are rich, which are exhausted, which streams are running dry, which insect swarms are on the move. If one tree begins to suffer from drought, its neighbors, sensing the chemical change in its sap, may respond by passing water through the network, even at cost to themselves, because in a forest, the survival of one is tied to the survival of all, and in that slow, silent generosity is a kind of wisdom we humans rarely practice. But not all exchanges are gentle. Some trees, particularly certain species of walnut or black locust, release toxins into the soil, seeping them into the network to suppress the growth of rivals, a form of chemical warfare we call allelopathy, showing that the forest, for all its cooperation, is not without its politics, its rivalries, its quiet battles fought over light and space and nutrients. Above the ground, the conversation continues in another dialect, one of scents and invisible vapors, volatile organic compounds released into the air that can drift far beyond the canopy, and when a giraffe begins to feed on the leaves of an African acacia, within minutes nearby acacias detect the airborne warning and flood their own leaves with bitter tannins, making them unappetizing, and sometimes even driving the animals to move on. In this way, a feeding giraffe may trigger a chain reaction across a savanna, as tree after tree joins the alarm until the air itself carries a quiet warning. Danger is near. Yet trees do more than warn. They call for help, summoning the allies they cannot grow themselves, as when a corn plant attacked by caterpillars releases a specific chemical blend into the air that attracts parasitic wasps, which swoop in to lay their eggs inside the caterpillars, killing them from within. The forest is full of such alliances, between plant and insect, plant and bird, plant and fungus. A living web of mutual aid and quiet defense, and all of it happening whether we are there to notice or not. Imagine, for a moment, the slowness of it, how a signal in the root network may take hours or even days to travel from one grove to another, and yet, in the life of a tree that is no more rushed than our own heartbeat is to us. Imagine conversations that began before you were born and will continue. Long after you are gone, messages that travel across decades like letters carried by the wind, and in that slowness there is a lesson, that communication does not always need to be fast to be effective, and that perhaps in our own lives, Slowing down might allow us to hear things we have been missing. Stand in an old-growth forest and you can almost feel it, the weight of these ongoing exchanges, the sense that you are inside something vast and alive and interconnected, a place where the boundaries between individual lives are softer than we think, where a single tree is never truly alone because it is stitched into the fabric of the whole. We have only just begun to decipher this language, yet already it changes how we see the green world around us. No longer as a backdrop to our lives, but as a society in its own right, with its own history, its own conflicts, its own acts of kindness, and perhaps even its own culture, passed not in stories told aloud but in signals carried through sap and soil. And the more we learn, the more we realize that to harm one part of this network is to send a ripple through the entire system, weakening the whole, and that the health of the forest and our own survival are not separate questions but threads in the same weave, for we breathe what they give, we drink what they protect, and we shelter under what they grow. And yet too often we cut away at the very network that sustains us without hearing the alarm bells they send through their roots. But the trees are still speaking, whether or not we listen, and if we could only quiet ourselves long enough to truly hear them, we might find that their slow, patient language has been telling us the same thing for centuries. That life is not a race, that strength lies in connection, and that in the end, survival is not about standing tallest, but about standing together. Then we drift deeper into this living cathedral, letting the filtered green light dim as the canopy thickens overhead, each step sinking us into the rich scent of damp soil and the faint sweetness of decay that feeds life here. And in this place you begin to sense that you are not walking alone, not in the human sense, but in the quiet awareness that thousands of beings are taking note of your presence, not as an intruder but as another ripple in their shared field of existence. And this recognition is not felt through sight or sound, but through the invisible chemistry of breath and touch. For every exhalation you give is drawn into leaves above, transformed, and returned as oxygen, and every faint vibration of your footfall moves through root and mycelium like a subtle knock on a door that is always answered. Here, in the stillness, the trees are speaking of water, of where it lies deep underground, of how far the roots must stretch to find it, of how it must be shared to keep the youngest alive in the driest months. And in the network's slow hum you can almost hear the seasons themselves, the way spring sends a surge of sugar to the buds, the way summer thickens the air with scent to draw in bees, the way autumn leans into release, letting leaves drop not in silence but in the faint crackle of starches breaking down into nutrients that will feed the roots through winter. The forest speaks of danger too, for somewhere upwind a stand of pines is under siege by bark beetles, and already the neighboring trees are shifting their internal chemistry, flooding their resin ducts, thickening their defenses, sending warnings through both the air and the soil, so that even species far removed from pine will be ready to resist their own insect invaders. And yet, alongside warning there is reassurance. An old cedar sending nutrients to a shaded sapling, not because it expects return but because in this society of roots and leaves, nurturing the young ensures the future of all. Human minds tend to seek intent in such acts, but here in the deep green, intent may not matter. What matters is the action, the unbroken cycle of give and receive that has kept these groves alive through storms, fires, droughts, and centuries of quiet watching. Think, for a moment, of what it means to have elders who have stood for 500 years, their rings holding the memory of centuries of rain and famine, of insect plagues and the return of birds after long winters. And through all of it they have remained not as individuals but as part of a community that thinks and acts in patterns too slow for us to see without years of patient observation. Scientists have measured these exchanges, traced the carbon molecules from one trunk to another, mapped the fungal threads like subway lines under the soil, and yet even with this knowledge there is something elusive, something that cannot be captured in data alone. The sense that these exchanges are not just mechanical processes but the forest's way of holding itself together, of remembering itself across lifetimes. Perhaps this is why people who spend time in old forests often speak of feeling smaller, quieter, more at peace. Because here, the chatter of human urgency is drowned out by a slower, older rhythm, one that asks nothing of us except that we notice. And in noticing, we begin to learn a different kind of listening. Not for words, but for patterns, for shifts in the air, for the way certain scents grow sharper after rain, for the faint electric taste in the wind before a storm that the leaves have already read and responded to. This is communication not built for speed but for endurance, and in its endurance is wisdom, that every message sent is part of a web that holds not just the forest but the entire fabric of life together, a web we walk through every day without knowing it, and one that will keep humming its slow messages long after we are gone, just as it has hummed them long before we arrived. Then we lean further into the shadowed silence, not as intruders but as temporary guests in an ancient council that has been in session for millions of years, a council where the minutes are not taken in ink but in rings of wood, in layers of soil, in the patient spread of roots that record every drought, every flood, every migration of creatures through this place. And in this vast parliament of life, every tree, shrub, fern, and fungal thread is both a participant and a listener, contributing to a slow, ongoing dialogue that blurs the line between the individual and the whole, for here individuality is a gentle fiction. The truth is connection, a constant exchange of resources and information that ensures the forest's survival far more than any one tree's strength could. To the human eye, a forest might look like a collection of separate trunks, each rising alone toward the sky, but beneath the surface, it is a single breathing organism spread across acres, even miles, stitched together by the mycorrhizal networks that carry messages in chemical code. And this is not unlike the neurons in our brain, each tree like a cell, each fungal thread like an axon carrying signals from one part of the forest's mind to another. And when you consider this, you realize that to walk through an old forest is to walk through a living brain, one that thinks in centuries instead of seconds, one whose thoughts are measured not in words but in the shift of nutrient flows, the timing of seed drops, the release of scents that summon allies or warn of danger. And yet, unlike our human minds, the forest's intelligence is not centralized. There is no single trunk issuing commands. It is distributed, democratic, with each participant responding to its own needs while contributing to the needs of others, a balance of self-interest and cooperation that has allowed these systems to thrive for longer than human civilization has existed. This means that when a mother tree, the largest, oldest in a grove, begins to die, she does not simply fall silent. Instead, she floods the network with her remaining resources, sending carbon, nitrogen, and defensive compounds to her offspring and even to unrelated trees, ensuring that the community's resilience outlasts her own life. And this act, though it unfolds slowly, carries the weight of a farewell speech, a final gift written not in language but in sustenance. Above the soil, her canopy thins, letting more light fall to the forest floor where seeds, some of which she dropped decades earlier, now seize the chance to grow, and in this way, her death becomes the birth of new stories. There are myths among some indigenous peoples that speak of trees as ancestors, as elders whose spirits remain in the wood even after they fall. And when you understand the science of their communication, it becomes difficult to dismiss these stories as mere poetry, for they speak to something real, that the life of a tree extends beyond its own body, that it remains part of the forest long after its trunk has rotted away. In the Amazon, researchers have found ghost trees, stumps that have no leaves and no photosynthesis, yet remain alive, kept fed by their neighbors through the root network for decades, and this act, mysterious and without obvious benefit, challenges the human idea of competition as the sole driver of life. Perhaps the forest teaches us that survival is a shared project, that even those who cannot contribute in the usual ways are still worth keeping alive, because their existence enriches the whole. And yet, these lessons are not offered in lectures or proclamations. They are there for anyone who takes the time to watch, to listen, to feel the subtle shifts in the air, the changes in birdsong when a certain tree comes into bloom, the faint scent that drifts from a stand of willows after an insect attack, summoning predatory bugs to protect their leaves. Even our own lives are quietly braided into this system. The air we breathe is the exhalation of leaves, the water we drink is filtered through roots and soil. The food we eat depends on pollinators drawn to the scents and colors that trees and plants have spent millions of years perfecting. And yet, in much of our modern living, we move as if separate from this network, cutting, clearing, and paving without hearing the cries that ripple through the underground web when we sever its threads. Scientists have recorded the chemical distress signals that spike when a tree is cut, the sudden surge of warning compounds sent to its neighbors, and though these signals are not pain in the human sense, they are undeniably a response to harm, a shift in the body of the forest that says, something is wrong. And here is the truth that is both humbling and urgent. The forest can live without us, but we cannot live without it. Every moment you are alive is sustained by this quiet, ancient network, this patient conversation of roots and leaves and fungal threads, and perhaps if we remembered that, if we learned to listen not only with our ears but with our entire awareness, we might begin to treat the green world not as scenery, but as kin. Imagine, for a moment, what it would mean if our cities communicated like forests, if resources were shared through hidden channels so that no one went without, if warnings of danger rippled through in time to protect the most vulnerable, if the oldest and strongest gave of themselves to ensure the young could grow. This is not fantasy. It is a model already in place, tested by time longer than our species has walked the earth. And perhaps the first step toward learning from it is simply to step into the forest and be still long enough to hear the conversation happening all around you. A conversation that has no words, yet speaks of connection, resilience, patience, and life itself in a voice older than language. And so we remain in this cathedral of green, breathing in air that was exhaled by countless leaves just moments ago. And the more we stand here, the more we begin to feel the pulse of a language not carried on sound waves but on shifts in chemistry, temperature, and subtle vibration. A language tuned to the slow heartbeat of the earth rather than the frantic ticking of our clocks, and as we tune ourselves to it, we notice how different parts of the forest speak in different tones. The towering canopy trees, centuries old, speak in the deep, steady rhythms of long memory, carrying news across wide distances, while the saplings and shrubs speak more urgently, their short lives requiring quicker adjustments to the changes in light, moisture, and wind. In the stillness, our senses sharpen and we can almost feel the invisible rivers of carbon moving down from the leaves into the roots, then out along the mycorrhizal highways into the bodies of neighboring trees, each molecule carrying not just energy but a message. I am here, I am thriving, I have enough to share. And in other places, the messages are edged with warning. The sudden release of ethylene into the air by a tree under insect attack, the bitter chemicals pushed into its leaves to make them unpalatable, the signal carried on the wind to others of its kind so that they, too, can begin their quiet preparations. This exchange is constant, and it reveals a truth that feels at once alien and deeply familiar. That communication is not the exclusive gift of creatures with mouths and ears, but a property of life itself, expressed in whatever medium the body allows. For trees, that medium is the flow of sap, the diffusion of scent molecules, the subtle shifts in electrical potential across root membranes, and though these processes happen too slowly for us to see without instruments, their meaning is no less real than a shouted warning across a field. Perhaps this is why so many who have lived close to the land speak of hearing the forest. They have learned to read these slow signals in the tilt of a branch, the curl of a leaf, the sudden absence of bird calls. Modern science, with its sensors and tracers, now confirms what traditional knowledge has long known, that forests are networks of conversation, each species a different voice, each individual tree a node in the great chorus, and that this conversation shapes the very structure of the ecosystem. In one study, when a dominant tree in a grove was removed, the pattern of underground communication shifted dramatically, altering the growth rates and even the survival chances of other trees for decades afterward, as if the removal of one voice had changed the entire grammar of the forest's language. And here we might pause to consider how human actions, logging, clearing, introducing invasive species, are not just physical disruptions but linguistic ones, breaking the threads of dialogue that have held these communities together for centuries, leaving gaps in meaning that cannot be easily filled. The tragedy is that we often act as if the forest's silence means absence of thought or care, when in truth it is speaking all the time, but at a tempo we have forgotten how to match. Yet there is hope in this because we can relearn that tempo. We can slow ourselves to the pace of roots and seasons, we can walk without the demand for instant answers, we can sit beside a single tree for an hour and begin to see how much happens in what we call stillness. And if we do, we may notice that the speech of the forest is not only about survival but also about generosity, about the willingness to feed a neighbor even if it is a different species, about the quiet reciprocity between tree and fungus, between plant and insect, between root and rock. This reciprocity is the forest's law, one that does not fit neatly into our human categories of altruism or self-interest because it is both at once, and perhaps this is the most profound lesson of all. That life does not need to choose between caring for itself and caring for others, because in the long arc of survival, the two are inseparable. When we understand this, we begin to see the trees differently. Not as isolated beings, but as letters in a living script that writes itself across continents and centuries, a script we have barely begun to read, and one whose meaning, once grasped, could change not only how we see the natural world but how we see ourselves within it. Then let us sink even deeper into this living manuscript, letting the edges of our human sense of time dissolve until the slow conversations of the forest begin to feel almost immediate, as if the boundaries between seconds, minutes, and decades have softened into one continuous present, because for the trees, there is no hurry. They speak in the rhythm of sunrises and seasons, their language stretched across lifetimes, and as we walk further, we begin to sense that every step is an interruption to a meeting that has been going on since before our species learned to stand upright. The ground beneath us is not just soil, but an archive, a library whose shelves are made of roots, each storing records of past droughts, floods, migrations, and fires in subtle chemical codes passed from generation to generation. Imagine, for a moment, tracing one of those roots downward through the cool earth until it joins a web of fungal threads so fine they are invisible to the naked eye, yet so vast they can connect entire forests together in a single network, carrying sugars, minerals, and even warning signals between trees separated by hundreds of feet. An underground internet billions of years older than the human one. Here, a birch shares carbon with a neighboring fir during the bright abundance of summer, and later, in the dim of autumn, the fir repays the favor with nutrients it has drawn from deeper soil layers. A trade without contracts, conducted in perfect trust. Nearby, an old cedar, scarred by lightning decades ago, still sends its reserves to younger saplings when their leaves show signs of stress, and those saplings, in turn, may one day feed others, so that a single act of giving can echo through centuries. Scientists who map these networks find that the largest, oldest trees, the so-called mother trees, are often the hubs, connecting to hundreds of others, not just kin but strangers, ensuring that information and resources move across the forest like blood through a living body. And yet, these elders are also vulnerable, for when a mother tree is cut down, her absence can be felt in the decline of those connected to her. A reminder that in a community so interlinked, the loss of one is the diminishment of all. Above ground, the language of trees takes another form, volatile organic compounds drifting invisibly through the air, carrying news of insect invasions, fungal infections, or even physical damage. An acacia savanna in Africa, for instance, becomes a battlefield of scent when giraffes browse too heavily. The trees pump tannins into their leaves to make them bitter, while releasing ethylene gas that drifts on the wind to warn others, prompting them to do the same. And this communication is not limited to defense. Flowers release specific scents to signal pollinators, timing their perfume to the hours when bees or moths are most active. And the chemistry of these signals can shift if weather or competition changes, as if adjusting the vocabulary to ensure the message is understood. What's more, these signals can cross species boundaries, with certain plants able to detect and respond to the distress cues of entirely different kinds of neighbors, suggesting a kind of ecological empathy that challenges our narrow definitions of intelligence. Even the slowest processes carry meaning. The way a tree allocates growth to roots or branches can signal the state of the environment to those around it. The tilt of a trunk toward light creating subtle shifts in the shade patterns that influence seedlings, the fall of leaves feeding the soil community in specific nutrient ratios that affect what can grow next. In this way, the forest is not just a collection of individual survival strategies, but a constantly evolving negotiation among countless participants, a negotiation in which no single being holds the full plan, yet all benefit from its unfolding. If we were to translate this into human terms, it would be as if every household in a city quietly adjusted its energy, food, and waste in response to the needs of the others without a central government or even spoken agreements, simply because that is how the city as a whole survives. Perhaps this is why walking through an ancient forest feels different from walking through a young plantation. In the former, you are stepping into a web so dense with history and connection that the very air feels weighted with meaning, while in the latter, the conversation is still young, the sentences short, the relationships tentative. In the depth of an old-growth stand, the silence hums because it is not silence at all. It is the accumulation of voices too slow for our impatient ears, yet vast enough to hold the memory of centuries. And here we might ask ourselves, what could we learn if we truly listened? Not just with our minds, but with our bodies tuned to the pace of the forest. Could we learn to share without keeping score, to respond to distress before it becomes catastrophe, to value elders not just for their past but for the stability they give the present? The trees already live this way, and they have done so since before mammals existed. The tragedy is that we, in our haste, so often sever these systems before we understand them, cutting down a tree without realizing that in doing so, we may have silenced a voice in a language we barely know exists, a voice whose absence will ripple invisibly through the forest for decades. Yet the hope remains, because the forest is patient, and when given the chance, it heals. Roots will seek out old connections, fungi will bridge gaps, seeds will germinate in the light left behind, and the conversation will continue, altered but unbroken, as it has for millions of years. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson the trees offer us, that even in loss, there can be renewal, and that the truest strength lies not in standing alone, but in being part of something larger, older, and wiser than ourselves. Then we will keep walking in this uninterrupted current of thought, letting the forest speak through the long weave of our words, because once you begin to sense that trees are not static monuments but active participants in an ancient conversation, every step among them changes. Suddenly, you notice how the moss on one side of a trunk is thicker than the other, perhaps shaped by prevailing winds or the way dew collects, and this in itself is a kind of language, a record of the microclimate spoken in the texture of living green. You notice how fallen branches do not simply decay, but are pulled into the mouths of fungi whose filaments will carry nutrients back into the bodies of standing trees, as if the forest recycles not just matter but meaning. And if you kneel and press your palm to the soil, you might feel, in imagination if not in literal sensation, the faint electrical murmurs running along roots, each spike and dip a signal in the quiet code of plant life. Scientists have measured these bioelectric signals and found that they can change in response to touch, to light, to injury, much as nerve impulses shift in our own bodies, not as quickly, but no less purposefully. And here is where human metaphor risks breaking down, because to say that trees talk is true in spirit but imperfect in detail. Their communication is not a translation of our speech, but an entirely different mode of being in relation. It is less about discrete words and more about gradients, flows, and rhythms, a communication that only makes sense when stretched across hours, days, and seasons. Imagine if every time you wanted to greet a friend, you did so by subtly shifting the airs sent over the course of a week, or by slowly adjusting the distribution of water through an underground pipe until it reached them. To us, this feels unbearably slow, but for trees, this is the normal tempo of life. And in accepting this, we begin to see that slowness is only a matter of perspective, because to a tree that lives for 500 years, a single growing season is like a paragraph in a long novel, and an entire human lifetime may be only a chapter. And yet, these chapters are full of interwoven plots. Competition for light, collaboration for nutrients, mutual defense against herbivores, shared shelter for the smaller beings who live in their shade. Some trees even seem to recognize kin from stranger, sending more resources through root connections to genetically related seedlings than to unrelated ones, a subtle favoritism that mirrors patterns of care in many animal societies. At the same time, not all is cooperation. There are allelopathic species that release chemicals into the soil to suppress the growth of neighbors, creating empty rings around themselves like moats, not out of malice but as a strategy to ensure survival in resource-poor environments. These chemical skirmishes are as much a part of the forest story as the generous exchanges, reminding us that communication is not always kind, and that even in the plant world, relationships are complex, shifting between alliance and rivalry depending on context. Above all, the forest's language is ecological. Every signal is tied to the health of the whole system, whether it be a warning of drought carried in diminished sugar flows, or the increase in root exudates when a tree detects that a neighbor is faltering, perhaps in an attempt to prop them up. This is where the philosophical reflection begins to bloom. If trees can sense the condition of others and adjust their behavior in response, are they not participating in a form of awareness? It may not be awareness as we define it in human terms, but it is still a structured, adaptive response to the presence of others, shaped by evolution to maintain balance. And perhaps the reason we are so drawn to forests, even without knowing why, is that somewhere deep in our own biology we recognize this, that life, in its healthiest form, exists not in isolation but in continuous exchange. The tragedy, of course, is that much of modern human activity treats trees as mute resources rather than as members of an ancient network, leading to the clear-cutting of old-growth stands whose webs of connection cannot be replaced in a single generation, or to monoculture plantations that mimic the look of a forest without the depth of its conversation. But if we pause long enough to truly listen, we might realize that saving forests is not simply about protecting biodiversity or stabilizing climate, though those are essential. It is also about preserving the very conversations that hold landscapes together. And once you start thinking of a forest as a society, cutting down a 1,000-year-old cedar feels less like harvesting a crop and more like erasing an elder from the record of history. In that light, restoration becomes not just an environmental duty but a cultural one. Reweaving the severed lines of dialogue so that the young trees planted today may, centuries from now, be the elders who guide and nourish others. And perhaps, if we allow them, these slow-speaking giants will teach us that the pace of life need not always be a sprint, that sometimes the most profound connections are made in the patient work of centuries, and that the truest language of all may be the one spoken without words, carried instead in the quiet exchange of breath, light, water, and time itself. And so we wander further into this living cathedral, the canopy above shifting like a mosaic of green and gold as the light filters through. And in that shifting glow it becomes clear that the story of how trees speak is not only written in the chemical whispers of their leaves or the silent transactions beneath the soil, but also in the myths and folklore that humans have woven around them for millennia, as if our ancestors, without microscopes or genetic analysis, still sensed that these beings were far from mute. In Norse legend, the great world tree Yggdrasil connected all realms, its roots drinking from wells of wisdom and fate, its branches touching the heavens, a vision not far from the reality that a forest's roots reach into deep time while its leaves touch the current moment. In Celtic tradition, certain trees like the oak, ash, and yew were revered as gateways to other worlds, their presence marking sacred ground where humans might receive messages not from gods in the sky but from the earth itself. Even in Japanese Shinto belief, the idea of Kodama, spirits inhabiting ancient trees, echoes a deep respect for the individuality and dignity of each tree, a recognition that what stands before us is not merely wood and chlorophyll, but a living presence with history and agency. Across cultures, the same intuitive thread emerges. That trees listen, that they remember, that they speak, albeit not in the impatient tempo of human tongues, and this cultural reverence, born from centuries of observation, often aligns with what science now confirms, that forests are indeed communities with memory and responsiveness. Consider, for instance, how tree rings not only record the age of a tree but also hold the story of climate over decades and centuries, each ring varying in width, density, and isotopic composition to reflect seasons of drought, abundance, fire, or frost, as if the tree has been keeping a journal in the grain of its wood. Dendrochronologists can read these rings to reconstruct not only weather patterns but also ecological events, such as volcanic eruptions or insect outbreaks, effectively turning trees into historians whose archives are accessible to those who know the language. And while rings tell the story of the past, the present is written in the subtle adjustments a tree makes each day, opening or closing stomata in response to humidity, leaning toward a shaft of sunlight, thickening leaves in response to wind, each act a physical sentence in the ongoing dialogue with its surroundings. What is perhaps most humbling is that this language operates without a central brain, yet achieves a level of coordination across miles of forest that rivals our most complex cities. This decentralization, far from being a limitation, allows the forest to adapt as a whole to shifting conditions, much like a murmuration of starlings changes shape in response to predators without a single leader giving orders. And if we look closer, we see that trees also converse indirectly through the animals they host, fruits ripening at specific times to signal birds and mammals to carry seeds away, flowers timing their nectar flows to coincide with the activity of their preferred pollinators, even bark patterns and resin scents acting as cues to the insects and fungi that form part of their extended community. The forest, then, is a polyglot society, speaking in light, scent, taste, texture, and vibration, each message tailored to its audience, each received and interpreted in ways that weave the system together. Yet, in our human rush, we often miss these messages entirely, moving through the woods as if we are in a museum of silent exhibits rather than a bustling marketplace of exchange. But once you begin to notice, you cannot unsee it. The way the leaves of one tree will subtly quiver more than its neighbors in response to a distant disturbance. The way a sudden hush of birdsong signals that the canopy has passed along a warning. The way certain saplings will bend their growth to fill a shaft of light opened by the fall of an elder. Not in random opportunism but in a choreography dictated by space, shade, and wind. All of this points toward a truth we might resist because it challenges our comfortable hierarchy. That communication is not a privilege of creatures with faces, and that intelligence is not confined to quickness of response. In fact, the trees may remind us that depth of response, the ability to adjust slowly but with lasting impact, is a kind of wisdom that our fast-moving species often lacks. Perhaps that is why we return to forests when our own lives feel fragmented, drawn instinctively to the patient pulse of these green nations, where each voice is part of a harmony older than our species, a harmony we can only hear when we slow ourselves to its rhythm. Then let us sink even deeper into this single, unbroken thread, because the more we look at how trees communicate, the more we realize that their language is not confined to the surface phenomena of rustling leaves or seasonal blooms, but is embedded in a complex biological infrastructure that spans both the seen and unseen. Beginning with the mycorrhizal networks beneath our feet, vast fungal highways that connect the roots of individual trees into an interdependent community, sometimes called the wood wide web, where filaments thinner than a hair transport not only water and nutrients, but also chemical messages that can alter the behavior of other plants. Through these mycorrhizal threads, an old, established tree can send surplus carbon to a shaded sapling that might otherwise wither, while that same sapling can send distress signals when under attack by pests, prompting nearby trees to produce defensive chemicals in advance. Researchers like Suzanne Simard have shown that these networks often have central hub trees, sometimes called mother trees, that nurture dozens or even hundreds of younger ones, their influence stretching far beyond the space their trunks occupy. And in knowing this, the idea of a forest as a random collection of trees collapses into the richer truth that it is a living, communicating organism made of many bodies. The air above tells its own stories too, for when a tree is attacked by herbivorous insects, it can release volatile organic compounds that drift to nearby plants of the same or even different species, effectively sending an airborne warning that triggers the production of bitter or toxic chemicals to deter further feeding. Some trees even tailor these chemical messages to attract predators of the pests that are harming them, enlisting allies in a form of ecological diplomacy that plays out silently but with life or death stakes. Such complexity forces us to reconsider what we mean by intelligence, because although trees lack neurons, they integrate information from multiple sensory inputs: light, gravity, moisture, chemical gradients, even mechanical vibrations, and make adaptive decisions that improve survival, decisions that are not instantaneous like ours but measured, deliberate, and often more enduring in their impact. Perhaps the slowness of their communication is not a weakness at all, but a design shaped by lifespans that can stretch centuries or even millennia, where rushing would be irrelevant and costly. And when you imagine the passage of 1,000 years in the life of a redwood or baobab, you begin to understand that these beings measure time not in moments but in epochs. Their very growth rings the heartbeat of centuries. In this way, tree communication becomes a living bridge between the fleeting now of our human perception and the deep time in which forests exist. And maybe this is why standing among ancient trees can evoke feelings of humility and even awe. We are not just surrounded by tall plants, but by elders who have been listening, responding, and remembering long before our civilizations were born. If we slow ourselves enough, we might catch a fragment of their conversation: the faint shift in the taste of the air when certain flowers open, the softened humidity under a dense canopy that signals water retention strategies at work, the staggered blooming cycles designed so that pollinators never go hungry. It becomes clear that their speech is not just for themselves but for the wider web of life, because every adjustment they make, every shade cast, every root extended, every molecule released, ripples outward to insects, birds, mammals, fungi, and even the microbial life in the soil, creating a living symphony in which no note is wasted. The tragedy, of course, is that we often bulldoze through this orchestra without even knowing it exists, replacing the layered, multi-voiced song of an old-growth forest with the monotone hum of monocultures, and in doing so we silence conversations that took centuries to evolve. But the hope is that the science revealing these networks also rekindles the ancient respect humans once had for trees, a respect visible in cultures that treated them as kin, spirits, or gods, not because of superstition alone, but because deep observation showed that trees sustain and protect life in ways far too intricate to dismiss. Perhaps, if we can relearn that patience and humility, we might still find ways to re-enter the conversation, to plant and protect not just for shade or timber, but for the restoration of a dialogue that is essential to the balance of the planet. And in the end, to listen to the trees is to remember that silence is not emptiness, that slowness is not stagnation, and that some of the most important voices in our world do not speak in words at all, but in the quiet, continuous exchange of breath, water, and light. A language older than time as we know it, and one that will go on speaking long after we have fallen silent. We step even further into this vast, breathing network, letting our imagination sink into the soil as the fine root hairs and fungal hyphae wind around each other like braided threads of some ancient loom, weaving a tapestry that is both map and memory of the forest. For in these underground threads lies not only the present moment's transactions but also the echoes of past seasons, droughts endured, storms survived, fires scarred into bark and then healed over. And as the roots push deeper, they do not do so blindly but with the same cautious awareness that a careful traveler uses when entering unknown terrain, sensing gradients of water and minerals, navigating toward the sources that will sustain not just the individual but the network as a whole. Here, communication is inseparable from cooperation, and cooperation is not a sentimental ideal but a survival strategy honed over millions of years. One that recognizes that a thriving neighbor is not a competitor but an ally in maintaining the shared canopy and stable microclimate that all depend on. And while we humans have often told ourselves that nature is a battlefield where only the strongest prevail, forests show us another model, one where the strongest are often those that share the most, where generosity and reciprocity form the backbone of resilience, and where a single fallen elder becomes not waste but nourishment, its trunk slowly becoming home to fungi, insects, mosses, and new seedlings that rise from the very matter of the old. Think, too, of the way trees mark time, not with our hurried days and deadlines, but with cycles that stretch far beyond the span of a human life. How the bristlecone pine may live for 5,000 years, sending its messages through wood and root as dynasties rise and fall, as languages are born and forgotten, as continents shift imperceptibly beneath the feet of generations. To such beings, our chatter must seem like the rapid patter of rain on leaves, intense but fleeting, gone before the sun dries the forest floor, and yet they respond to us, too, in ways subtle and profound, absorbing the excess carbon we release, filtering our air, cooling our cities, offering fruit, shelter, and medicine without demanding anything but space and the freedom to live according to their own rhythms. But these rhythms are easily disrupted, and here lies another layer of their communication. The signals of stress that ripple outward when chainsaws begin to bite, when the soil is compacted by heavy machinery, when the diversity of the understory is stripped away. The forest speaks of imbalance through withering crowns, premature leaf drop, the spread of pests once kept in check by a healthy system. And in these signs, if we care to read them, lies both warning and plea. And so the conversation between humans and trees is not one-sided. For while we may think of ourselves as the observers, the ones who measure and categorize, the truth is that trees have been responding to us all along, adjusting their growth in the altered climate we have made, shifting their blooming times, migrating their ranges slowly upslope or poleward, carrying in their very bodies the record of our presence and the pressure we exert. Perhaps this is why those who spend enough time among them often report a feeling of being seen, not in the anthropomorphic sense of eyes following you, but in the deeper sense of being recognized as part of the same living web, a node in the same network of exchange. And here the science loops back into the spiritual, for whether we frame it in terms of biochemistry or in the language of myth, the truth remains that trees respond to the world and to each other in ways that are deliberate, purposeful, and relational. The oak does not drop its acorns at random but times them to the availability of seed dispersers, sometimes even synchronizing with others of its kind so that the bounty overwhelms predators and ensures that some seeds survive. The acacia, under attack by browsing giraffes, increases tannin levels in its leaves and releases ethylene gas to warn others downwind, prompting them to do the same. The willows send out salicylic acid derivatives that not only deter insects but also act as antimicrobial agents, protecting wounds from infection. These are not accidents but evolved strategies, honed by countless iterations of trial and success in the long evolutionary conversation between plant and environment. And in knowing this, perhaps the most radical thing we can do is to stop seeing trees as passive background to human drama, and start seeing them as active participants, as storytellers whose language, though different from ours, speaks of patience, interdependence, and the art of living well in one place for a very long time. And if we listen long enough, we might even begin to model our own lives after theirs, to root deeply, to reach toward the light, to give more than we take, and to remember that the truest measure of a life well lived may not be how quickly it moves, but how much it contributes to the flourishing of the whole forest around it. Then let us continue from that very breath, because to understand how trees speak without words is also to understand that they carry not just the immediate voice of the present moment but the deep, resonant echoes of the past, each ring in their trunk a chapter in a story we rarely stop to read. A story written in the language of rainfall and drought, of warm summers and hard winters, of fires that licked their bark but did not consume them, leaving black scars as punctuation marks in their long biography. And if we were to saw through that trunk, though I hope we never would, we would see those rings not just as records of years but as transcripts of environmental conversations, each thicker ring telling of abundance, each thinner one whispering of struggle, each anomaly hinting at some extraordinary event that shook the forest that year. And the roots below, stretching often twice as far as the canopy above, carry those same stories into the soil, where the oldest and most experienced trees hold a kind of memory bank for the community, sharing information about water tables, nutrient hotspots, and seasonal changes with younger trees who have yet to develop their own resilience, much like an elder passing down hard-earned wisdom to the young. And here, in this flow of information, you find a striking truth, that survival in a forest is not an individual achievement but a collective one, that the well-being of one tree is tied to the health of its neighbors, that a forest is only as strong as its network, and that the communication holding it together is not ornamental but essential. And this language of connection extends even to death, because when a tree finally falls, whether from age, disease, or the weight of a storm, it doesn't vanish from the conversation. It simply changes its role, becoming nurse log and shelter, releasing stored nutrients into the soil, hosting mosses, fungi, and entire colonies of insects whose work will eventually feed the roots of the next generation. In this way, the conversation is endless, cycling through forms and bodies but never truly stopping, the message always being renewed. Life begets life, connection begets strength, but for all their patience and silence, trees are not immune to urgency, for there are times when they must act swiftly, at least by their standards, a sudden pest outbreak, a lightning strike, the encroachment of human clearing, and in such moments their chemical signals spike, their internal flows shift, their entire physiology reorients toward defense or repair, and while we might still call this slow compared to our nervous system, it is no less precise, no less deliberate. Yet the greatest tragedy is that in our own speed and distraction, we often fail to see these signals, or worse, we ignore them entirely, pushing forward with development, logging, and monoculture plantations that strip away the diversity and richness required for this network to function, silencing voices that took centuries to emerge. But there is hope in the growing body of science that reveals just how intelligent, responsive, and interwoven these beings are, because with knowledge comes the possibility of empathy, and with empathy the possibility of change. And perhaps that change begins not in grand policies but in the quiet, personal act of noticing, of walking into a forest and realizing that you are surrounded by a living conversation, that the creak of a trunk in the wind is more than random sound, that the scent of pine released after rain is both invitation and announcement, that even the pattern of fallen leaves on the forest floor tells you something about the health and history of the trees above. And once you notice, you cannot unsee it, and once you cannot unsee it, you begin to move differently. Slower, more attentive, more aware that every step presses into a network that is listening, that every moment spent here is part of a larger exchange in which you are not just an observer but a participant. And maybe that is the most profound thing trees can teach us, that the measure of communication is not in the volume or speed of words, but in the depth of connection, in the way a message transforms the receiver, in the way it ripples outward through a community. So when the wind moves through the leaves and you hear that low, collective rustle, perhaps you will think of it not just as background noise but as the forest's voice, carrying a conversation that began long before you were born and will continue long after you are gone, reminding you, in its patient, persistent way, that you are part of a story far older and wider than yourself. Then we let the thought flow on, deeper and deeper into that green cathedral. For the forest does not end where the trunks meet the air but extends invisibly into realms we cannot see, into the subterranean labyrinth where fungal threads called mycelium form vast living maps beneath our feet, networks so intricate that a teaspoon of soil can contain several miles of these microscopic filaments, each one a line in the forest's silent script, a conduit through which trees send not only nutrients but information, warnings, and perhaps, in some way beyond our understanding, a sense of presence itself. And when we stand in such a place, our boots pressing against roots that snake in all directions, we are unknowingly standing on a communication grid older than human civilization, a web that connects not only members of the same species but often entire communities of plants, shrubs, and even fungi themselves, all exchanging data in a form we are only just beginning to decipher. Scientists call it the Wood Wide Web, but the trees have never needed such a name. To them, it is simply how life is lived, a continuous exchange that blurs the line between self and other, a reminder that individuality is not isolation but a node in an ever-evolving whole. And as we pull back from the soil and let our gaze rise to the canopy, we see another form of conversation playing out in the slow choreography of branches and leaves, the way they angle themselves toward light not in competition but in quiet coordination, allowing space for neighbors so that the forest's collective photosynthesis is maximized, as though each tree understands that the well-being of the whole ensures the survival of the one. Here, communication is not a matter of dominance but of balance, of countless subtle adjustments to shifting conditions of sun, shade, and wind. And speaking of wind, the trees use it not just as a force to endure but as a messenger to carry their scents, volatile organic compounds that can travel for miles, announcing the onset of flowering to pollinators, broadcasting distress calls when attacked by pests, or even masking themselves to avoid detection. And in this chemical language, timing is everything because a signal sent too early may be ignored, while one sent too late may find the damage already done. Yet despite this precision, their language is not hurried, for trees move in a different tempo, one that measures urgency not in seconds but in seasons, a rhythm so unhurried that to us it appears as stillness, though it is anything but. And here we must pause to admit that part of the reason we have overlooked this dialogue for so long is that we humans are impatient listeners, tuned to quick exchanges and loud declarations, rarely willing to sit in the slow unfolding of meaning. And yet if we truly gave our attention to this tempo, we might find that the forest has been addressing us all along, in the shifting hues of its leaves as seasons turn, in the subtle variations of its scent after rain or drought, in the chorus of creaks and sighs that accompany a strong wind, in the way certain trees bend rather than break under pressure. Even the play of light filtering through leaves is a kind of language, signaling to understory plants when to grow and when to rest, guiding their cycles in a way as dependable as any calendar. And so the forest speaks on multiple frequencies, above and below ground, in scents and chemicals, in light and shadow, in posture and gesture, and even in death, where fallen trunks continue the conversation by shaping the microhabitats and nutrient flows for decades to come. And perhaps the most humbling thing about this language is that it requires no audience to justify itself. Trees do not speak for our benefit, and yet the more we learn, the more we realize that their survival strategies and modes of care carry lessons for our own fractured societies. For in the forest, competition exists but is tempered by cooperation, individuality is honored but never severed from the collective, and survival is achieved not by taking as much as possible but by ensuring that the system as a whole remains balanced and resilient. And if we could adopt even a fraction of that ethos, if we could learn to listen without demanding control, to give without the guarantee of return, to stand rooted yet open, perhaps our own communities would grow stronger, more enduring. But here is the paradox. To truly hear the forest's voice, we must first quiet our own. We must slow down enough to match its pace, which in a world obsessed with speed is an act of resistance in itself. And when we do, when we surrender to the slowness, we begin to notice that the forest is never truly silent, that there is always a murmur. The faint hiss of leaves shifting against each other, the distant tapping of a woodpecker sending vibrations down a trunk, the imperceptible stretch of fibers as a branch sways in the breeze. All of it is conversation, all of it is connection, all of it is life speaking to life in a language that predates us by hundreds of millions of years and will likely outlast us by just as many. A language that reminds us that words are only one small part of what it means to communicate, and that meaning can be carried in scent, in touch, in shared resources, in simple presence. And as you stand there, listening with more than your ears, you begin to understand that the forest's greatest message is not about how trees speak, but about why they do. Not to conquer, not to boast, but to sustain, to endure, to ensure that life, in all its forms, continues to flow through this green cathedral for as long as the earth will allow. We let that sentence dissolve into the stillness and allow the thought to stretch onward. Because to walk deeper into this living cathedral is to realize that the conversation between trees is not only horizontal, neighbor to neighbor, but also vertical, a dialogue that runs from the youngest seedling pushing its way through the dark soil toward the light, to the towering elders whose crowns have brushed the sky for centuries. And in this vertical exchange there is a form of mentorship unlike anything we practice, for the older trees, through their expansive root systems and their dominance in light capture, have access to resources that they can share with those still struggling in the shadows below. And they do so not blindly but selectively, sometimes channeling extra sugars and nutrients to saplings that are genetically related, a kind of family favoritism, and at other times supporting entirely unrelated species whose presence strengthens the diversity and stability of the ecosystem as a whole, showing us that kinship in the forest is not purely a matter of blood, but also of function and benefit to the collective. And when a seedling receives such aid, it is not just receiving food, it is receiving time. Extra seasons to grow slowly, to establish itself, to survive the lean years until it can sustain its own life. And this granting of time is perhaps the forest's most profound gift, because in giving time, the elder tree ensures continuity, ensures that the voice of the species will not fade when storms come. And storms always come in one form or another, hurricanes that strip branches and topple trunks, wildfires that roar through with unstoppable force, infestations that arrive like whispers at first but spread like shadows until whole swaths of green are gone. And yet, even here, the conversation does not end, because in the aftermath of destruction, there is always a new phase of dialogue, one focused on regeneration, on the recolonization of bare soil by mosses and fungi, on the germination of seeds that have waited in silence for exactly such a moment, as though the forest itself knows that loss is not the end but the clearing of space for what comes next. And while all of this may seem like instinct, like automatic biological programming, the more we learn about the subtle decision-making in resource distribution, in chemical signaling, in defensive strategies, the more it challenges our narrow definitions of intelligence and awareness. For here is an entire community behaving in ways that are adaptive, strategic, and responsive to both immediate and long-term needs, without any central leader dictating the plan. And perhaps that is the part of the forest's language that unsettles us most. Its refusal to conform to our hierarchical ways of thinking, its demonstration that order and resilience can emerge from decentralized cooperation, that a network without a single ruler can still achieve harmony, stability, and collective benefit. And in a time when human systems strain under the weight of inequality, competition, and environmental collapse, maybe it is not just the beauty of the forest we should admire but the structure of its communication, its ability to self-regulate, to support the vulnerable, to adapt without losing its essence. And yet, for all its wisdom, the forest remains vulnerable to us, for we are the only force that can alter its conversation so violently that the network itself collapses. Clear-cutting that severs not just trunks but entire underground webs, pollution that disrupts chemical signals, climate shifts that push species beyond their survival thresholds, monoculture plantations that silence the diverse voices required for true resilience. And when we do this, we are not just removing trees, we are breaking apart an ancient dialogue, ending conversations that have been flowing without interruption for hundreds, even thousands of years. But there is another possibility, one that begins with something as simple as walking into the forest not to take, not to conquer, but to listen, to truly listen with the patience the forest demands, and in that listening perhaps to realize that we too are part of this network, that our breath is tied to theirs, that the carbon they store and the oxygen they release are threads in the same web that holds our lives in place. And once you feel that, once you let that truth settle into you like the slow seep of water into roots, you cannot help but change. Your steps grow lighter, your voice softer, your choices more careful, because you understand that every act, no matter how small, sends ripples through this vast, green conversation. And maybe, just maybe, that is the beginning of speaking back to the forest in its own language. Not with words, but with respect, with reciprocity, with the willingness to let our lives, too, be shaped by the rhythm of giving and receiving, of standing firm yet staying connected, of growing not just upward toward the light but outward into the web that holds us all. And so we let the thought continue its climb, like a vine winding upward along an ancient trunk, because once you recognize that the forest is not merely a collection of individual trees but a living, breathing network of relationships, you begin to see its every detail differently. The moss on a fallen log is no longer just decoration, but an early colonizer preparing the wood for the next wave of life, breaking it down into nutrients that will be shared with seedlings nearby. The bird nesting in the hollow of an oak is not merely taking shelter, but is itself a messenger, carrying seeds from distant trees to new soil, further weaving together the tapestry of the ecosystem. The fungi glowing faintly under moonlight are not just strange curiosities, but vital translators in the biochemical conversations happening beneath the ground, decoding sugars from roots into forms other plants can use, passing warnings across species lines as if the forest were a multilingual council. And this recognition spreads outward into your perception of time itself, because you realize the forest's clock does not tick in hours or even days, but in growth rings and centuries. Its patience stretching far beyond the urgency of human schedules, and in that patience is a kind of wisdom we are rarely taught, that stability comes not from speed, but from balance, from cycles of giving and taking that extend beyond a single lifetime. And when you watch the light shift through the canopy over the course of a single day, you understand that this too is part of the conversation. The trees adjusting the tilt of their leaves, regulating their intake of sunlight, ensuring that no single branch overheats or wilts, while still allowing enough light to pass through to nourish the plants below. And it is in such small, nearly invisible acts that the forest shows its generosity, its refusal to hoard all resources for the tallest or strongest, a lesson we often fail to learn in our own systems. But to grasp this, you must be willing to meet the forest at its tempo, to abandon, if only for a moment, the compulsion to measure progress in immediate results, because in the forest, progress is the slow accumulation of layers. Leaf litter turning to soil, soil nourishing roots, roots supporting trunks, trunks sheltering countless lives, until the whole becomes more than the sum of its parts. And it is here that we return to the idea that trees speak without words, for what is a fallen leaf if not a sentence in the language of decay? A message to fungi and microorganisms that the feast has begun, that it is time to break apart the old to make way for the new. What is the bloom of flowers in spring if not a declaration? A bright and fragrant announcement to pollinators that the cycle is ready to turn again. What is the deepening green of summer if not an affirmation of strength and abundance? What is the fiery blaze of autumn if not a bittersweet farewell, a reminder that even in letting go there can be beauty? And what is the stark skeleton of winter branches if not an act of endurance, a quiet vow to return when the warmth comes back? In every season, the forest speaks, and the fact that most of us do not hear it does not mean the conversation isn't happening. It only means we have forgotten how to listen. But when you begin to listen, really listen, you find that the forest's voice is not something external to you, for the rhythm of its exchange is mirrored in your own body, in the inhale that takes in the oxygen trees release, in the exhale that gives them the carbon they need, in the beating of your heart that slows. When you stand among them, as though some deep, ancient part of your nervous system recognizes their presence as home. And perhaps that is why people across cultures and centuries have found peace beneath the shade of trees, why we speak of them as wise, why we plant them to mark births, to honor the dead, to commemorate moments we wish to last beyond us. Because even if we cannot put their language into our words, we can feel it in our bones, in the way their silence somehow says more than most of our noise ever could. And in that silence, there is an invitation, a beckoning to step out of the narrow frame of our own lifespans and into the vast, patient continuum of the forest, to live not as isolated beings scrambling for survival, but as participants in a conversation that began long before we arrived and will continue long after we are gone, provided we choose to keep it alive. And so the thought moves forward like roots seeking water in hidden depths, because once you begin to see the forest as a conversation rather than a backdrop, you realize that every part of it, from the tallest canopy giant to the tiniest grain of soil, is part of an unbroken exchange, and this changes the way you notice details. The way the wind moves through branches is no longer just weather, but a voice carrying pollen, scents, and subtle signals to distant neighbors. The way bark thickens over decades becomes not merely a physical adaptation, but a record of seasons endured, a silent autobiography written in texture and scars. Even the shade that falls on the forest floor is not accidental but a deliberate shaping of the underworld, determining which seedlings thrive, which remain in waiting, and which fade away. For the forest knows that space is as much a resource as sunlight or water, and it manages that space with the same care as any of its tangible gifts. And beneath it all, the fungal threads, the mycorrhizal networks, continue their invisible work, ferrying nutrients, warning of pests, distributing water during droughts, a decentralized, self-organizing communication system older than human civilization itself, one that operates without wires, without servers, without any of the infrastructure we consider necessary, and yet it is far more resilient than most of our inventions. And this brings us to the humbling realization that intelligence is not limited to what has eyes or a brain, because here is a form of collective awareness that can survive storms, fires, and centuries of change without collapsing, adapting continuously without ever losing its integrity. And perhaps that is what unsettles us, the recognition that the forest thrives without hierarchy, that it achieves balance not by central authority but through countless small acts of mutual benefit, and that such balance is not utopia but a constantly negotiated reality in which death and decay are not failures but essential contributions. And when you look closer, you see that the fallen tree is not gone but transformed, feeding fungi, sheltering insects, enriching the soil that will nourish future trees, and this cyclical generosity is what keeps the forest alive, a generosity we often fail to practice because we fear letting go of what we've built. And yet, in the forest's way, letting go is as important as growth, for the leaves that drop in autumn, the branches that fall in storms, the entire trunks that collapse after centuries, all of it feeds the next generation, all of it is given back without hesitation. And maybe this is where the language of trees has its deepest lesson for us. That strength is not just about holding on, but about knowing when to release, trusting that what you give away will return to the cycle in a new form. And in this understanding, the forest becomes more than a habitat. It becomes a model for how to live, how to cooperate, how to endure without exhausting the very ground we stand on. And once you've seen this, it's impossible to stand among trees without feeling part of something larger than yourself, without sensing the quiet pull of connection that runs deeper than any words could describe, because the truth is, we are not outside the forest's conversation. We are inside it, breathing its breath, walking on its body, carried along in its endless exchange. And if we can learn to hear it again, to answer it not with chainsaws and smoke but with care and reciprocity, then perhaps we can take our place in that conversation as contributors rather than disruptors, as listeners as much as speakers, as beings willing to live not just for ourselves but for the network that holds us all, visible and invisible alike. And as the sentence stretches on like the shadow of a leaning cedar in the last light of day, the awareness deepens that this network, this living, breathing intelligence, is not bound by the limits of human perception, for it moves at a pace our senses are not built to register, unfolding in hours, days, and decades rather than seconds, speaking in shifts of chemistry and subtle physical changes rather than in sound. And yet it is no less a language simply because it is slower than ours. In fact, there is something profoundly humbling about realizing that perhaps the fault has never been in trees being silent, but in us, being impatient listeners, expecting every truth worth knowing to reveal itself quickly, when in reality, the forest speaks in a cadence that requires us to linger, to slow ourselves to the rhythm of seasons rather than seconds. And in that slowing, we notice that each ring inside a tree's trunk is not just a marker of age but a chapter in a long autobiography. Wide rings telling of years when the rains came on time and the sun was generous. Narrow rings marking years of drought or cold when growth was a struggle. And that this story is shared with its neighbors, for in the harshest seasons, trees connected through their underground fungal allies will sometimes redistribute resources, sending sugars and water to the weaker members of the forest so that the whole community survives together. And this kind of mutual aid is not an act of charity in the way humans often frame it, but a recognition that in the forest's design, no tree is truly separate from the others, and the health of one affects the fate of many. And here lies another truth. The forest is not static. It is a constant act of negotiation, of giving and receiving, a balancing act between competition and cooperation. Because while trees will race upward toward the light, they will also bend their branches away from one another to allow a neighbor its share of the sun. And while roots will spread far and wide in search of water, they will not hoard it to the point of starving the ground around them. For the long memory of the forest seems to understand that greed is a short-term strategy with a long-term cost, and survival here has always been a collective achievement. And perhaps this is why, when we walk through old-growth forests where trunks rise like columns in a cathedral, the feeling we experience is not just aesthetic appreciation but something closer to reverence, because on some unspoken level, we recognize that what we are witnessing is the physical embodiment of a cooperation so ancient, so enduring, that it has outlasted empires, rewritten landscapes, and quietly shaped the air we breathe every moment of our lives. And this reverence deepens when you remember that the oxygen filling your lungs right now, this very second, may have been released from the leaves of a tree thousands of miles away, carried here by winds that have circled the planet, meaning that you and the forest are not merely neighbors, you are collaborators in the same endless exchange, partners in a cycle that predates human memory and will, if we are wise enough to protect it, continue long after we are gone. And it is here, in this interwoven truth, that we might begin to hear the clearest part of the forest's speech, not in the rustle of leaves or the creak of trunks, but in the way it lives out the principle that nothing truly belongs to one alone, that what is given returns in another form, and that the health of the whole is the truest form of wealth. And if we were to take this lesson into our own cities, our own systems, perhaps our relationships with each other would shift in ways as profound as the quiet shifts that happen under the forest floor. For the mycelial threads do not ask which tree is tallest or most beautiful before they deliver nutrients. They simply recognize need and respond, and in that recognition lies a blueprint for a kind of civilization that does not burn through its resources until there is nothing left to give, but instead keeps enough in circulation to ensure that even the smallest sapling, even the oldest hollowed trunk, still has a role, still has value. And maybe that is the heart of what trees are saying, in a language without words, that endurance is not about standing alone, but about standing together in a network of care so steady, so constant, that even when storms come, the forest does not fall as one, but bends, breaks, and regrows in an endless testament to resilience. And when you keep following that thread of thought, it becomes almost impossible not to see the parallels between the forest's patient, invisible conversations and the conversations that sustain our own lives. Because just as trees pass unseen signals through their roots and through the air, we too communicate in countless ways that rarely reach the surface. In the tone of a voice, the pause between sentences, the glance that lingers a fraction longer than usual, and perhaps, like us, trees rely on a blend of urgency and subtlety, sending out chemical alarms when danger is near, like when a caterpillar begins to chew on its leaves and the tree responds by releasing airborne compounds that warn its neighbors to prepare their defenses. And this warning system is so precise that it can distinguish between different attackers, tailoring its chemical message for the specific threat, much like a well-written note that only the intended reader understands. And beneath the soil, the messages are slower but no less deliberate. A steady traffic of carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, and even water, flowing through mycorrhizal highways that bind species together into a kind of ancient internet, one without screens or code but with protocols older than life on land. And while humans sometimes speak of the selfish gene as the driving force of life, here in the forest we find that survival often depends on the unselfish root, the one that gives when it could keep, the one that ensures that the network remains strong enough to withstand the next drought, the next disease, the next hard winter. And the beauty of this system is that it doesn't just connect members of the same species. A towering oak may share with a young beech, a birch with a fir, suggesting that the forest's loyalties are not tribal but ecological, oriented toward the stability of the whole rather than the supremacy of the individual. And it's worth pausing here to consider how alien this is to the way we often organize our societies, where competition is celebrated and cooperation is treated as exceptional rather than fundamental. And yet, when disaster strikes, whether flood, fire, or famine, it is cooperation that determines survival, just as it does for the forest. And maybe this is why walking in the woods feels so strangely calming, because on some level our nervous systems recognize that we are in the presence of a form of order that is both strong and kind, firm and generous, and it awakens in us a memory of belonging to such a system ourselves. And as the seasons turn, the forest's language shifts but never stops. In spring, the rush of growth sends sugars flowing like messages of encouragement. In summer, the canopy hums with the exchange of resources and warnings. In autumn, the trees loosen their hold on their leaves, letting them fall not as waste but as offerings to the soil. And in winter, they retreat into a slower, quieter mode of communication, conserving energy while still maintaining the threads that keep them linked. Because even in dormancy, the network remains alive, ready to awaken at the first hint of warmth. And perhaps the most profound thing about this language is that it is not spoken in haste but in trust, for trees know, if such a word can be used, that the messages they send today may take days or weeks to fully arrive, and yet they send them anyway, a reminder that not all conversations need to be instant to be meaningful, and that some of the most important exchanges in life happen at a pace that seems glacial by modern human standards but is perfectly in tune with the rhythm of endurance. And if we could learn to think in that timescale, to act with the patience of a tree sending food to a neighbor it will never meet again in leaf but whose seedlings might one day share its sunlight, perhaps we would not only save the forests we still have, but become more like them, quiet, steady, generous in ways that are not showy but enduring, speaking without words but saying exactly what is needed. And in that vision of becoming more like the forest, you begin to realize that the quiet generosity of trees is not born from some fleeting moment of kindness but from a deep, almost geological understanding that nothing exists in isolation, that life is not a straight line but a circle where every gift eventually returns in another form. And when you watch the way an old tree allows its roots to fuse with the roots of its neighbors, even after it has stopped producing leaves of its own, feeding them from the reserves stored in its vast trunk, you see that death itself is not an ending in the forest's vocabulary but a transformation, a passing of strength into the soil and into the lives of others, so that even a fallen giant continues to give. Its decaying would becoming a nursery for mosses, fungi, insects, and eventually seedlings that will rise toward the sky in its place, carrying forward not just its nutrients but the genetic memory of centuries spent learning how to survive storms, droughts, and winters. And here, beneath the whispering leaves and the filtered sunlight, you begin to understand that the forest is not simply a collection of individuals but a single organism spread across miles, with each tree a cell, each root a vein, each mycorrhizal thread a nerve in a living body that can feel, respond, adapt, and remember. Its memory stored not in a brain but in the distributed intelligence of countless interactions, so that when a pest arrives one season, the forest's defenses are stronger the next. When fire sweeps through one part, the surviving edges send out seeds and resources to rebuild, and when a species begins to weaken, others step in to fill its role until it can recover. And this, perhaps, is the truest form of language. Not just the exchange of information, but the weaving of resilience, the creation of a shared history that ensures no part of the whole is ever entirely alone. And in this recognition, you can't help but wonder what it would mean if humans could listen deeply enough to learn this tongue, to sense the faint electrical pulses that travel from root tip to root tip, to smell the airborne signatures of distress or abundance, to read the shifting hues of leaves as sentences written in green and gold. And if we could, would we find that the forest has been speaking to us all along, urging patience where we rush, offering stability where we chase novelty, reminding us that growth without connection is brittle, and that survival without generosity is hollow. And maybe that is why, when you stand in the stillness of a forest and hear nothing but the wind and the distant tap of a woodpecker, you feel an odd sense of being understood, because the forest's language is not about demanding your attention but about sharing its presence. A presence so steady that you only truly notice it when you stop moving, when you match your breath to the slow sway of branches, when you let your thoughts quiet enough for your senses to pick up the background hum of life exchanging itself endlessly, without hurry, without greed, without the need for applause. And it is in that space, unmeasured by clocks, unbroken by words, that you finally hear the message trees have been sending for millennia. We are not apart from each other, we are part of each other. And once that message takes root in you, it begins to rearrange the way you see not only the forest but the entire living world. Because if trees and fungi and even the unseen billions of microbes in the soil can weave themselves into a single, balanced, enduring system without central control, without competition as their defining force, then perhaps the idea that our own societies must be built on endless rivalry and accumulation is not a law of nature at all but a choice we have been making, and a choice we could unmake, replacing it with something that mirrors the forest's deep intelligence, where strength comes not from standing apart but from leaning into the network, from giving without keeping count, from remembering that the well-being of the whole is the well-being of the individual. And you notice that in the forest there is no waste, the leaf that falls is food, the body that decays is scaffolding for new life, the shadow cast by one branch becomes shelter for something small and tender. So nothing is discarded simply because it has finished one role, everything is folded back into the cycle, and that cycle is not just mechanical but deeply relational, because the act of returning what was once yours to the community is the very thing that ensures your own survival in ways you can't yet see. And here you realize that the conversation trees have is not just an exchange of resources or warnings, but a constant affirmation of interdependence. A reminder written into every root crossing, every nutrient trade, every fungal filament that stretches between strangers, that life is not something you own, it is something you share. And maybe that's why spending time among trees can leave you feeling calmer, steadier, more grounded, because your nervous system is being reminded of its original programming, the one that evolved in ecosystems like this, where survival was a collective effort and safety came from belonging to something larger than yourself. And perhaps the unease so many people feel in the modern world comes from being cut off from that belonging, from living as if we are separate when in truth we have never been. And the forest doesn't shout this truth, it doesn't try to convince you with arguments or data. It simply shows you over and over again, in every season, in every slow exchange beneath the soil, that connection is the foundation of life, and it will keep showing you as long as it stands, even if you never learn to name the language it speaks. And in that quiet knowing, you may begin to feel a different kind of responsibility. Not the frantic urgency of human deadlines, but the patient care of a long-term steward, someone who understands that the seeds you plant now, the way you treat the soil now, the respect you give to the network now, will echo far beyond your own lifetime, feeding lives you will never meet, sheltering beings you will never see, and perhaps that is the truest measure of our place in the conversation. Not how loudly we speak, but how well we listen, and how gracefully we give back what we have been given. And as you commit to listening more closely, you start to notice the layers within the forest's voice, the way the canopy speaks in light and shadow, dappling the understory with shifting mosaics that tell seedlings when it is safe to grow and when they must wait. The way the understory itself speaks in the soft rustle of leaves and the slow unfurling of ferns, letting you know that patience is not simply a virtue here, it is the only way to survive. And beneath that, in the cool, damp dark of the soil, there is an even slower and older conversation unfolding, one that happens in molecules and ions, in threads of mycelium so fine they could pass through the eye of a needle, carrying information from one end of the forest to the other in a process so deliberate that, to our hurried minds, it might seem like no movement at all, and yet it is movement essential, constant, and alive. And when you lean into that slowness, when you let your awareness stretch to match the pace of these exchanges, you begin to realize that speed has never been the measure of intelligence here, but rather adaptability, subtlety, and endurance, and you can't help but wonder how differently our own species might live if we measured wisdom not by how quickly we could act, but by how well we could sense and respond to the needs of the whole system over lifetimes instead of fiscal quarters. And there is a profound humility that comes with this thought, because it forces you to see yourself not as an observer standing outside the forest, but as a participant in the same network, subject to the same laws of reciprocity, the same need to balance taking with giving, and it becomes impossible to imagine your survival apart from the survival of this web, because the air you breathe is drawn from the tree's exhalations, the water you drink is filtered by the soil they hold in place, the climate that allows you to live is stabilized by their slow, patient work. And this awareness is not meant to inspire guilt or fear, but rather a deeper form of gratitude, the kind that stirs you to act not out of obligation but out of kinship, knowing that every gesture of care toward the forest, whether planting a tree, protecting a watershed, or simply allowing a patch of wildness to remain untouched, is in fact an act of care toward yourself and everyone who will breathe after you. And in this way, the forest teaches without preaching, shapes without commanding, heals without demanding payment, And perhaps this is the most extraordinary part of its silent language, that it does not need to persuade you with arguments, because the truth it holds is older than any words, etched into the shared biology of life itself. A truth that hums beneath the noise of our modern lives, waiting for us to quiet down enough to hear it. And as you let yourself sink deeper into this awareness, it becomes clear that the forest's voice is not a single melody but a vast and shifting chorus, one in which every living being, from the tallest cedar to the smallest bacterium clinging to a root hair, plays a role in maintaining the harmony, and this harmony is not accidental. It is the product of millions of years of trial, error, and adjustment, each generation of trees and fungi and animals passing forward the subtle adaptations that allowed them to not only endure but to thrive together. And as you stand in that cathedral of green, you realize that nothing here survives by isolation, nothing here dominates without also serving, and the health of the whole is the sum of countless acts of exchange, generosity, and balance. The roots that dive deep into the earth are not simply pulling water for themselves, they are sharing it with neighbors through capillary-like networks, passing sugars produced in the sunlight to those shaded beneath them, receiving in return the minerals drawn up by the mycorrhizal fungi, whose own survival depends on keeping their tree partners strong. And the leaves high in the canopy are not simply catching sunlight for themselves but are also shaping the quality of light that reaches the ground, influencing which species can grow there. And when a tree falls, it does not mark an ending but the release of decades, even centuries, of stored energy back into the system. A slow cascade of nutrients that will feed fungi, mosses, insects, and eventually the next generation of trees, meaning that the conversation does not end with death but changes dialect, continuing in a form you might never notice unless you learn to read its signs. And as this realization takes root in your mind, you begin to feel the artificiality of the lines we draw between life and death, between the individual and the community, between me and not me. Because the forest is constantly blurring those lines, showing that the molecules in your body were once parts of leaves, of rain, of soil, of sunlight caught and transformed into sugars long before you were born, and that, after you are gone, they will flow back into the great living network to be taken up by roots, breathed by leaves, carried in rivers, and stitched into the bodies of beings yet to come. And in this light, the forest's language is not merely one of survival, but of belonging. Belonging to something vast enough to outlast you and intimate enough to sustain you in every breath. And you begin to wonder what our human world might look like if we could take even a fraction of this understanding and weave it into our ways of living, if our cities could breathe like forests, if our economies could circulate resources like mycelium, if our politics could take their cues from the way trees decide where to send their sugars, not hoarding them in times of plenty but sharing them to ensure that no part of the system collapses. And as these thoughts unfurl, you begin to suspect that the forest has been offering us this blueprint for as long as we have existed, and that the reason we have not yet followed it is not because it is too complex, but because it is too simple, asking us to trade endless growth for balanced growth, extraction for reciprocity, ownership for participation, and in a world driven by the illusion of separation, that is perhaps the most radical idea of all. Yet here, beneath the patient canopy, it does not feel radical. It feels inevitable, as natural as roots seeking water, as certain as leaves turning toward the sun, and in that certainty, you understand that the forest will keep speaking, whether we listen or not, because this is what life does. It reaches out, connects, exchanges, and remembers, holding the thread of existence steady through all seasons, waiting for us to find our way back into the conversation. And the longer you stay in this state of listening, the more you begin to pick up on the forest's subtler inflections, the pauses and hesitations in its language, the way the creak of an old trunk in the wind is not just a sound but a statement of resilience, the way the slow spiral of a falling leaf is a release, a letting go that feeds something unseen, the way the quiet drip of water from moss into soil is part of a cycle so old that it predates the very species walking here to witness it. You start to sense that time in the forest moves differently than in the human world, not in a straight line from past to future, but in an endless looping, where every ending folds into a beginning, where decay is not a failure but an offering, where the young are nurtured not at the expense of the old but because of the old, as the nutrients from fallen giants feed the saplings that will one day stand in their place. And you realize that this cyclical sense of time is part of the reason the forest's voice is so steady. It does not panic at endings, because it knows they are simply transformations. It does not rush growth, because it knows that the slowest, most deliberate steps are the ones that last for centuries. And in this, the forest reveals another layer of its teaching. That urgency and sustainability rarely walk hand in hand, and that if we wish for our own societies to endure, we must learn to think in centuries, not in the shallow rhythms of quarterly reports or election cycles. And as this truth sinks in, you can feel your own nervous system beginning to entrain itself to the forest's pace, your breath deepening, your thoughts stretching out, no longer darting ahead to imagined futures or scrambling to rewrite the past, but settling into the simple fact of the present, where life is neither a race nor a static picture, but a slow and continuous exchange. In this pace, you begin to see connections that were invisible before. How the call of a bird alerts not only its own species but sends ripples of awareness through the squirrels, the insects, even the trees themselves through subtle chemical shifts in the air. How a sudden burst of rain is not just a change in weather but a signal that reshapes the activity of roots, fungi, and leaves within minutes. How the shifting of clouds above can adjust the chemical composition of the air you breathe in real time. And the more you notice, the more impossible it becomes to think of any part of the forest as separate from any other, because here individuality exists, but never in isolation. Every being is distinct yet inseparable from the whole, and you can't help but reflect on how far human culture has drifted from this truth, building systems that reward competition over cooperation, hoarding over sharing, dominance over balance. And you start to wonder if part of the ache so many feel in the modern world, that restless sense of disconnection, that constant search for meaning, is in fact a symptom of being cut off from the kind of deep, reciprocal belonging that the forest embodies effortlessly. Because here, meaning is not something to be hunted down or invented, it is something that flows naturally from participation in the whole, from knowing that what you take will be returned in some form, from understanding that your life is not a solitary possession but a thread in a pattern you can only glimpse in fragments, and perhaps that is why the forest's voice is so patient, because it knows that sooner or later we will remember. And when we do, we will realize that the trees have been speaking all along, not with words, but with the only language that truly lasts, the language of connection, of exchange, of life passing into life without end. And as you lean even further into this vast, wordless conversation, the boundaries between your own body and the forest begin to feel less certain, as if each breath you take is not merely an act of personal survival but a shared inhalation and exhalation with the trees around you. Their leaves drawing in the carbon dioxide you release, your lungs accepting the oxygen they give in return, and you realize that this exchange has been happening for as long as humans have existed. An unbroken rhythm older than language, older than civilization, older even than our species itself, a biological covenant that neither side negotiated yet both sides honor instinctively. The forest does not demand that you give back exactly what you take, nor does it measure your worth by your productivity. It simply accepts your participation in the cycle as evidence that you belong, and there is a profound relief in that. To belong without needing to prove it, to know that your place here is not conditional on your ability to compete or accumulate, but on your willingness to exist in harmony with the whole. And as you walk further, your senses begin to tune themselves to signals you might have dismissed before. The faint peppery scent that drifts from the leaves of a tree attacked by insects, a warning carried on the wind to its neighbors so they might strengthen their own defenses. The subtle dimming of light in the understory as the canopy shifts to regulate the temperature for the delicate seedlings below. The way a sudden stillness among the birds indicates the approach of a predator long before you see or hear it yourself. All of these are sentences in a language that has no alphabet, yet is as precise as any code we have ever devised, a language spoken in the timing of blooms, the tilt of a leaf, the arc of a root. And you cannot help but marvel at the intelligence that underlies it, an intelligence not housed in a single brain but distributed across millions of beings, each one aware in its own way, each one contributing to the shared awareness of the whole. And this makes you question the way we define intelligence in our own species, as though it were the property of individuals rather than the emergent property of relationships. Perhaps this is why so much of human wisdom has been rooted in the observation of nature, why cultures who lived in close relationship with the land so often built systems of reciprocity, storytelling, and ceremony that mirrored the patterns of the living world, because they understood that survival was never simply a matter of outcompeting others, but of listening deeply, adjusting continuously, and giving back in proportion to what was taken. And somewhere in the quiet of the forest, you feel a tug of longing for a way of living that honors these principles, not as romantic nostalgia but as a practical necessity. Because in a time when human activity has the power to alter the climate, to erase entire species, to shift the composition of the atmosphere itself, the ability to listen, truly listen, to the more than human voices around us may be the single most important skill we can relearn. And this listening does not happen in the rush of headlines or the hum of constant notifications. It happens here, in the patient attention to the way moss darkens after rain, to the way a tree leans ever so slightly toward the morning sun, to the way the air changes just before dusk, carrying with it the mingled sense of cooling soil and opening night flowers. And as you notice these things, you feel time itself begin to slow, the anxious forward pull of the human world easing as you align yourself with the steady, unhurried pulse of the forest, a rhythm that cares nothing for deadlines or profit margins, a rhythm that has outlasted empires and will likely outlast our own. Not because it resists change, but because it embraces it, folds it into the endless conversation, and keeps speaking in the only way it knows, through the patient, persistent exchange of life for life. And with each passing step, you find yourself more deeply woven into this vast conversation, not merely as an observer but as an active participant, because your footsteps compress the soil just enough to shift the way water will flow in the next rain. Your shadow briefly cools the moss beneath you, your scent drifts into the awareness of creatures you will never meet, and in these subtle ways you are already part of the forest's story whether you intended to be or not. For the forest does not recognize the human tendency to stand apart and declare ourselves separate from nature. To the forest, you are as much a thread in the weave as the roots, the stones, the lichens that cling to them, and the squirrels that scurry along their ridges. And in this understanding there is both humility and liberation. Humility in realizing that your existence is not the center of the system, and liberation in knowing you are not required to carry the whole of it alone. And as you pause near the base of an ancient tree, its bark furrowed with the deep lines of centuries, you imagine the layers within, the outer bark weathered by storms, the inner bark alive with the quiet work of carrying nutrients, the solid heartwood at the center holding the memory of every year's growth in concentric rings, each one a record of conditions long past. Wet years and dry years, years of abundance and years of strain, all preserved in the language of wood. And you wonder if, in some way, we humans also carry our years like this, layer upon layer of experience pressed into the grain of our being, each joy and sorrow forming a line in the shape of who we are. Perhaps, like the tree, we do not discard these layers but hold them, letting them form the core of our strength even when they are no longer active in our day-to-day life. And perhaps this is part of what the forest is always whispering. That nothing is wasted, that even loss and decay are folded into the foundation from which new growth will rise. And as you stand there, hand resting against the rough bark, you feel a faint vibration. Whether from the wind in the branches, the subtle movement of water within, or simply the echo of your own pulse meeting the tree's stillness, you cannot say. But it is enough to make you aware of the thin membrane between your life and the trees, and how both are expressions of the same deeper process, the same drive to reach toward light while remaining rooted in what sustains you. And it occurs to you that this is why the forest never seems to argue or boast, why its wisdom is delivered without the sharp edges of debate, because it does not need to convince you of its truth. It simply lives that truth in every fiber, in every exchange, in every season, and trusts that if you are quiet enough, you will understand. And perhaps that is the challenge for us. Not to invent a better language, but to relearn the one that has been here all along. The one that speaks in the creak of branches, the ripple of leaves, the scent of pine on cold air, the hush that falls just before a hawk sweeps overhead. And as this realization settles into you, you notice that the boundary between listening to the forest and listening to yourself has blurred, because in quieting your mind to hear the language of trees, you have also created space to hear your own deeper knowing, the voice within that moves more slowly than thought, that does not measure time in hours or minutes but in cycles, in tides, in seasons of becoming. And for the first time in a long while, you feel no urge to hurry, no need to count the steps ahead or retrace the ones behind, because you are here, fully here, in this shared breath, this shared moment, in the living conversation that will continue long after you have left the forest, and perhaps even long after you are gone from this world entirely. Because in the end, the forest's language is not only the voice of trees, but the voice of life itself, speaking through all who are willing to listen. And so you remain there, not as someone merely passing through, but as a guest who has finally understood the etiquette of the place. The way silence is not emptiness here but fullness. The way stillness is not absence of movement but the perfect balance of countless subtle motions, each in conversation with the others. You realize that while your mind has often chased answers, here the questions themselves feel more important, questions that cannot be resolved by quick logic or reduced to neat conclusions, but instead must be carried, turned over like a smooth stone in your pocket until its shape becomes familiar. And in the company of the forest, these questions are not burdens but companions, because the trees have been carrying their own unanswered questions for centuries. Questions written in the spiral grain of their wood, in the branching geometry of their limbs, in the underground tangle of their roots. And yet they continue to grow, to offer shade, to feed the soil, to shelter the small and the fragile, without waiting for certainty. And you think about how different our lives might be if we could live with that kind of patience, if we could accept that not every mystery demands a solution, that some are meant to deepen us rather than resolve. And as your attention drifts downward, you notice the soil itself, rich with the scent of life and death intertwined, the fallen leaves of last autumn, now softened into a tapestry of browns and golds, the thin white threads of fungi stitching it together, the beetles and earthworms moving purposefully in their unseen tasks, transforming decay into the nourishment that will rise again as green in the spring. And in this cycle you see a lesson as old as the world, that endings are never truly endings, that even what falls away in loss remains part of the whole, woven back into the fabric in ways we cannot always see. And perhaps this is part of the forest's speech too, the reminder that renewal is not a separate event from loss, but its natural continuation. And the more you listen, the more you notice how this truth is expressed in every scale of the forest's being, from the vast, slow migration of tree species across centuries to the sudden flutter of a moth's wings in a beam of sunlight, both held in the same web, both speaking the same language of change and return. And as your awareness expands to hold these layers at once, you begin to understand why the forest feels so complete, because it contains the whole arc of life within itself at all times. The birth of seedlings, the death of giants, the stillness between storms, the burst of regrowth after fire. And you realize that in your own life you have been taught to separate these phases, to celebrate beginnings, to resist endings, to rush through the in-between. But here, there is no hierarchy, no preference, only the deep acceptance that all are necessary, that each holds the others. And standing there, with the filtered light shifting above you and the quiet breathing of the earth beneath your feet, you feel that acceptance settle into your bones like something you have always known but forgotten, and you wonder how many other truths you have lost in the noise of the human world, truths that the forest would gladly give back to you if only you would linger long enough to receive them. And in that moment you make a silent promise, not the kind that must be kept through rigid discipline, but the kind that grows naturally from gratitude. To return here not just in body but in attention, to bring this listening into the rest of your life, to notice the subtle languages that speak all around you even in the city streets or the dim rooms of your home. For you understand now that the forest's speech is not limited to the forest itself, but echoes in every system that sustains life. In the rhythm of your own breath, in the pulse of rivers, in the migrations of birds across skies you cannot see, in the unseen handoff between day and night that happens without fail whether or not you are watching. And perhaps the greatest gift the forest offers is not its beauty, though that is immense, nor its peace, though that is healing, but the reminder that you are already part of a much larger conversation. One that began long before you were born and will continue long after. One that has room for your voice, if you choose to speak, but will carry on just as fully if you do not, because its purpose is not to center you, but to include you, to fold your small thread into the endless tapestry, so that your presence, however brief, adds its own shade of meaning to the whole. Then we continue, letting the mind sink deeper into this living cathedral, where the air itself feels thick with memory, as if every breath you take has passed through the green lungs of countless leaves, filtered by chlorophyll and time, carrying with it traces of sunlight from far-off days you'll never see. And in this realization, there's an almost dizzying sense of continuity. That you are, in a very real way, breathing in the exhalations of ancient forests, the size of trees that stood long before you, perhaps even before your species walked upright, and in return, you send back your own breath, rich with carbon, which will feed the very beings whose air sustains you. It is not a metaphor, but an exchange as old as life on Earth, a cycle so fundamental that without it, neither you nor the forest could exist. And in this silent trade, you find a form of communication more intimate than words, because it is not shaped in the mind but in the body. A dialogue written in molecules and light. And as you walk further into this green space, you begin to notice how the forest speaks in layers. Not just through the wind in the leaves or the hum of insects, but in the shifting composition of the air itself, the faint changes in scent that mark where a stand of pine begins, where damp earth yields to dry hillside, where a fallen tree has begun to soften into soil. These are not signals meant for you, yet they reach you all the same, subtle and precise, like the tone of a voice that reveals more than the words being spoken, and you realize that perhaps part of the reason we fail to hear the forest is not that it is silent, but that it does not tailor its language to our understanding. It speaks in the dialect of all living things, and we, having narrowed our listening to human tongues, have simply forgotten how to respond. And so you try, in your own clumsy way, to listen with the whole of yourself, to let the pattern of birdsong and the flicker of light through branches and the faint tick of expanding bark in the heat of the sun register not as separate sensations but as parts of a single, continuous message. And the longer you do this, the more the forest seems to draw you in, not in the sense of revealing some hidden treasure, but in making you aware that the treasure has been here all along. That the murmuring roots beneath your feet are constantly exchanging signals, pulses of sugar and chemical warnings traveling along fungal highways, alerting neighboring trees to drought or pest, directing extra nutrients towards seedlings shaded from the sun, and even, astonishingly, feeding the stumps of felled companions so that they linger in a kind of suspended half-life for decades. It is, in every sense, a society, not built on competition alone, as we so often assume, but on cooperation, on mutual survival, on an understanding that the health of each depends on the health of all. And you think about how alien this seems in the context of human culture, where survival is so often framed as an individual battle, where resources are hoarded rather than shared, and yet here in the forest, it is precisely the sharing that has allowed it to endure for millennia. And perhaps that is the deeper message hidden in the rustle of leaves and the quiet grip of roots on stone. That strength is not the ability to stand alone, but the willingness to be part of something larger than yourself. And as this sinks in, you begin to sense the forest not just as a place, but as a mind vast, slow, distributed across countless beings, thinking in seasons and centuries, holding the memory of storms and the knowledge of rains yet to come, a mind in which every tree is both an individual and a part of the whole, each with its own perspective shaped by the slope of the land, the reach of its roots, the history of light and shadow across its bark. And in this network, communication is not a luxury but a necessity, a way of ensuring that the weakest are not left to wither, that the balance of the whole is maintained, and as you absorb this, you realize that you are standing in the middle of a conversation that has been going on for longer than human speech itself, one that will continue whether you choose to listen or not, one that requires no witness to be true. And yet, in listening, you are changed because you are reminded that language is far more than words, that meaning is far more than what can be translated into human syntax, and that perhaps the truest forms of understanding happen in the spaces between translation, in the quiet recognition that even if you cannot fully speak the language of the forest, you can still feel it moving through you, reshaping the way you see the world beyond these trees, so that even when you return to the paved streets and the hum of machines, you will carry the forest's voice in you, faint but persistent, urging you to move more slowly, to notice more fully, to remember that the conversation is still happening all around you, if only you are willing to hear. Then let us walk further into this endless green, not with the hurried steps of someone trying to reach a destination, but with the unmeasured pace of one who has finally surrendered to the fact that there is no end here, only deeper and deeper layers of presence. For every step forward does not so much carry you to a new place as it carries you into a new moment of noticing, where the light has shifted by a fraction, where the soundscape has changed as one bird falls silent and another calls from some unseen perch, where the air grows warmer or cooler as you pass between shafts of sun and pools of shade. And as you move like this, you realize that your own body is becoming part of the forest's sensory web, your skin detecting the change in humidity, your ears mapping the location of a distant woodpecker, your nose catching the faint resinous tang of pine on the breeze, and without consciously deciding to, You begin to attune yourself the way a deer might, letting small cues shape your path. The bend of a branch, the scatter of fresh leaves on the ground suggesting a squirrel's breakfast. The faint path of flattened grass where some other animal passed earlier. And in this attunement, you begin to sense the forest's pulse, not metaphorically but as something you can almost measure. A slow rhythm in the way shadows drift, in the way breezes come and go, in the way certain silences stretch just long enough to make you wonder what has changed beyond your sight. And in that wondering, you find yourself thinking of the trees not as background scenery but as active presences, each with its own relationship to this moment. Some standing in full sunlight, their leaves trembling like coins catching the light, others leaning into the shadows, conserving energy, sending more resources down into their roots. And you imagine the vast, unseen exchanges happening beneath your feet, the sugars and signals passing along mycorrhizal threads, messages so subtle and constant that they make our own digital networks seem almost crude by comparison. For here, there are no dropped connections, no delays, only the unbroken flow of necessity and care. And you think of the mother trees scientists have spoken of, the elders whose roots touch dozens, even hundreds of others, channeling food and information across the understory, guiding the growth of seedlings too small to reach the light on their own, and you realize that this is leadership in its most natural form. Not the hoarding of resources, but their deliberate redistribution, not the consolidation of power, but the strengthening of the whole. And perhaps without realizing it, you begin to breathe differently, more slowly, as if matching the long exhalations of these giants, your own pulse syncing with something much older and steadier than yourself. And in that shift, something loosens in you. The need to measure this walk in minutes or steps, the urge to narrate it in your mind as if to make it useful later, and instead you find yourself simply here, without past or future pressing at the edges, held in the kind of present moment that feels rare in human life but is the constant state of the forest. And in this presence, your thoughts begin to quiet enough that you start to notice the quieter voices, the faint rasp of bark expanding in the warmth, the almost imperceptible patter of tiny seeds falling, the high, tight buzz of a gnat drifting too close to your ear, and each of these becomes a word in the forest's sentence, a syllable in its unending speech. And it occurs to you then that communication here is not about sending a single message from one place to another, but about maintaining a constant state of connection, a shared awareness that ebbs and flows but never disappears, so that when a threat does come, a sudden insect outbreak, an oncoming drought, the response is already in motion, the signals already traveling through the living network, the adjustments already being made, and you begin to wonder what it would mean for human communities to live this way, to keep such a steady current of connection running between us that help and adaptation could happen without debate or delay, that care would be the default state rather than the exception. And as you think this, you glance at a cluster of saplings, their thin trunks leaning ever so slightly toward one another as if drawn by invisible threads, and you find yourself believing, if only for a moment, that such a way of living is not impossible for us either, that we too could learn to lean in, to exchange, to listen without the constant need to speak over one another, and that perhaps the forest has been waiting all along for us to realize this. And in that thought, you feel again the humility that comes from knowing you are a guest here, a late arrival to a conversation that has been unfolding for hundreds of millions of years, and yet the forest does not hold your lateness against you. It welcomes you anyway, folds you into its living language and lets you walk on.